Welcome to my San Francisco story talk on Beertown. Let's get going and join the program already in progress. Thank you. Just in case, we want to share this with people in the future because I think it's a good, fun talk. All right, San Francisco Story, as you know, you get a goofy membership card. I put out a publication, but Friends of Woody get a very special little additional thing is I have the Woody Beer and Coffee Fund. And people pay into this, which is great to contribute to get me to be social and get out and see folks. But you don't have to enjoy a coffee or a beer with me. So if you want to do it sometime, let me know and we will schedule it. Okay. Beertown, Richmond District, you might think I'm going to talk about the Irish Mile, which is all the kind of Irish bars around Gary and Clement and Balboa in the inner Richmond. I am very familiar with these areas, with these bars. I spent a lot of my youth in a lot of them, and you can probably find me in the Plow and Stars at least once a week. But we're not actually going to talk about the Irish Mile, which is more of a 20th century invention, you might say, in the Richmond district. This goes back before that. And it's going to go to a place that you might find a little surprising if you went and looked at it today. This is the heart of Beertown. This is Fulton Street, around 7th Avenue. And if you go out there today, it's all apartment buildings, pretty sleepy, no real businesses. It's across from the park, but incredibly residential. So this, how was this beer town with saloons, and how did it get to be what it is today? Well, first we're going to go back in time. Here's my trusty Muni map, which got me all over the city for most of my adult life. And if we go back in time to 1869, we'll just kind of stop there for fun. We're going to look at a map, and you're going to see that San Francisco and the Richmond district look quite a bit the same. I mean, you would recognize it. That grid pattern, you see the big Golden Gate Park in the west side. I mean, there's some open spaces in the south for sure. But this is a very good example of how maps can tell you things and inform you, but they can also lie terribly. Because if you went back to 1869 or during any time pretty much in the 19th century to the Richmond district, you are not going to see that grid pattern that we see here on this map. It would look more like this. So this is circa 1890. We're looking north across today's Gary Boulevard. And this is what the Richmond district looked like for most of the 19th century. Very scrubby, sandy dunes, hills. You can kind of see here, I'll give you a little more wayfinders. Since it was a big open space that the city had not fully extended into, there was a great place for large institutions like hospitals and orphanages and cemeteries. So the Richmond district was essentially the home of the major cemeteries in San Francisco until well, let's say the first third of the 20th century. So that's, you see all those nice grid streets and you think, oh, yeah, it's all built up with the infrastructure, but it was mostly open. I don't know what this guy was thinking, building his house on 16th Avenue near Balboa, in the dunes here in the center of the Richmond district. This isn't far from my house today. In the background, you can kind of see a little observatory on the top of Strawberry Hill in Golden Gate Park. We're looking south. And I wrote a whole San Francisco story about that observatory. If you didn't read it, you can go look it up. And even into the 20th century, you will have parts of the Richmond district that are farms, like a dairy farm. I mean, this is what we're talking about. It's very rural. It's very open. It's almost considered in many ways a suburban or out of town place, the countryside. So this is where we're going to get the seeds of Beertown. Let's see if I can get over here. There you go. By the way, I just want to point out that's 21st Avenue, and those two houses are still there today. I walk by them all the time. I live off 21st Avenue. So if you're ever walking between Clement and Gary, take a look for those houses. If you went farther out to like Ocean Beach, I've done talks about roadhouses and a lot of things at Ocean Beach, but this was way out of town. This is the edge of the continent, right? And here it's like a cold Saharan desert, as you can tell. Here, I'll give you a little wayfinder. This is Balboa Street, where it would be today, and you can see the just the sand dunes. That building there was the Seal Rock House, a very early roadhouse, a bar at Ocean Beach, but it was very difficult even to get out there. So let's talk about that and how you got out to Ocean Beach in the 1800s. The first real major road that cut across the west side of the town was a toll road, the Point Lobos Road, which follows the route of Gary Boulevard today. So it was built as a toll road. The instigators, the investors who wanted to put it in, made a deal with the state to get it graded and put in. And they were able to collect tolls on it for people to get their carriages or ride a horse out what's today Gary Boulevard for a toll. And they had a toll house essentially where the Target is today, kind of up there at Masonic and Gary. And that way you could rent a buggy or a horse downtown and from a stable and take a ride out to the beach. And that's why you would have a roadhouse, because people would go out early in the morning with cigars and their friends. They would take a nice long ride through the dunes and the scrub. They would ride up and down the beach and they would be able to get a drink at a roadhouse or two. Now, the beach isn't enough. You have to have an attraction. So the first attraction that was built at the end of the toll road, basically the reason for the toll road was an early roadhouse called the Cliff House. And many of you know the Cliff House. You've eaten there perhaps. It's closed now. The pandemic and other issues have closed it. There are plans to reopen it, but it's had many different incarnations. And that was essentially the beginning, in many ways, of the Richmond district. It should not surprise you, or I guess maybe it does, is that the Richmond district starts with a road and a bar. That is what people come out here to see. And that gets us to this. This gentleman is out riding on Gary Boulevard today, Point Lobos Road. And you see in the background, there's a few houses, and these are not primarily residences, although people do live in them. They're mostly stops along the way that you're going to ride out and you're going to stop for a drink. You might get a meal. You might even get to play a card game. And as part of that, to kind of capture that traffic, there was a very early racetrack along the Point Lobos Road. Here you can see it right here, called the Golden Gate Driving Park. And again, if you went out there today, you would just not believe there was a racetrack there. It's between 24th Avenue and 27th. And you can see, you think like a racetrack has a nice even oval. Well, this was what's for harness racing. So you didn't really need the even oval. It wasn't that 1 mile thoroughbred racetrack. Harness racing was the big racetrack attraction in the early days. That's what people raised the horses for. That's what they bet on. It was all about harness racing. And because people are coming out to the races, we have the Driving Park Hotel, essentially a bar, roadhouse. We have the Homestead House, another bar, roadhouse, for the people coming out to the races or returning home from the beach. And even like you have a house like Mr. McCabe, who lived over around 20th Avenue, even there, it later becomes a roadhouse called the White House and another one called the Turf House. So this is the kind of environment we're talking about. You're going out to the countryside, you're stopping and having a drink. And that becomes more popular as the silver strikes happen. Very wealthy men start raising horses, thoroughbred horses, to race against each other, and they want a better track. And so a new racetrack is created in the inner Richmond district called the Bay District Racetrack in 1874. So let's give you a little orientation. These guys, it had some problems. The races would kind of start and stop. It didn't always do great making money. It was very much a place for rich men to kind of indulge in their horse racing and horse raising activities and kind of bet against each other. But you can see it had some problems, like these guys are seeing the races for free in the knolls above the dunes. So here we go. Let's take a closer look. This is an 1892 map at the Richmond district. And then we're going to zoom in and you see the cemeteries here, the large cemeteries on the right. and the Municipal Cemetery, which is where Lincoln Park is today, on the left. And then over here, we get a little closer, is the Golden Gate Racecourse, another name for the Bay District Racetrack. So it basically was if you went out Arguello today, First Avenue then, you were almost on the border of it. It basically went from Second to Fourth with the extra buildings and the fencing that went around. But this is looks more like a racetrack you might imagine, right? Kind of a 1 mile oval here in the inner Richmond district. Here's a view from Fulton Street. So we're looking north, and you can see it was in a little bit of a depression there in the dunes, graded there, but you can see the large grandstands and the judging stand there in the center. Little streetcar, little cable car to bring people out to the horse races. So it attracted people, and it was. This is the days before Netflix, so it was like you get the Knight Templars, which was a fraternal organization out there doing their drilling exercises, and you can even get a crowd for that. But essentially, the draw was not just the racing and the horses going around in a loop, but the betting and the drinking and the sociability, you might say, of going out to the races. So here's an 1892 lithograph, a great one. It's kind of a bird's eye view looking west across Golden Gate Park to the ocean. And we're going to do a little zeroing in on this because it's got some little elements that tell us what's going on in the Richmond district along Golden Gate Park in the 1890s. So let's kind of zero in over here. Okay, so let's see. That's Gary Boulevard today. You can see the steeple a little there to the right of the line. That's the first Star of the Sea church, or an early version of Star of the Sea at 8th Avenue and Gary. And then over here, we have the Conservatory of Flowers, which we all know in Golden Gate Park is there in 1892. And then there's another little funny building that you probably don't know about, not too far from the conservatory. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Number two there, it's what is this building doing in Golden Gate Park? And then three is where the racetrack is. And you can see some of the buildings that have come around the racetrack to serve the racetrack, but the really kind of important ones are over here. Let's kind of take a look. So here's Fifth Avenue, you can see at the bottom, and Seventh Avenue at the top. And you see just to the right of Fifth Avenue, you see what looks like a little cable car. That's kind of interesting. People don't often think about cable cars getting out to the Richmond district, but they did, and we'll get into that. And at 7th Avenue, if you look a little off to the right there, you see a steam train going south on 7th Avenue headed to the park. And again, something I don't think people really are aware of. And then number one right here, this is basically the place to be. If you're going to the races, if you're visiting the park, it was a place called Dickey's. There was a gentleman, Colonel Dickey, J.R. Dickey, who ran it as the host. And again, it's a roadhouse, restaurant, bar, and he had stables you can kind of see there in the back, where again, you rent your horse or you have a horse, you bring it out, you can stable it there behind Dickey's, have a meal, have a drink. He was a renowned host, and everybody knew Colonel Dickey for his basically being a sportsman, raising his own horses, but being part of the sporting life around horse racing and being an excellent host to people who attended races. Okay, and then number two down there, that's that odd building I was pointing out in the Golden Gate Park next to the conservatory. It was actually built in 1882 in Golden Gate Park as an early roadhouse. It was called the Casino. It was controversial pretty much from the start because the park commissioners didn't really like the idea of people drinking in the park and having a bar in the park, but it hung on for quite a long time, and was just part of this whole milieu of going to the races, going to the park, and having a beer. That's number three is our little steam train. Let's talk a little bit more about that. Where's it going to end up? Over here in Golden Gate Park at this building, which you may be familiar with, the Powell Street Railroad Company shelter. It's recently been kind of fixed up and painted. It looks great, but it was just one of the many ways that you would get to Golden Gate Park on the weekends or to go to a race. Let's kind of trace some routes here. So here's one way you can get out there. You could transfer to this little steam shuttle, which was a little mini train, steam powered, that would drag the cars down Arguello Boulevard, go west on Fulton, and dump you off around 7th, 8th Avenue. This started in the 1870s. Again, it's the races and it's the park that are spurring this sort of extension of transportation. So that's one way to get to Golden Gate Park and the racetrack. Let's look at another. You can see a little purple line there in the bottom. This is coming from the east. This is the McAllister Street cable car. It opens in 1883. It kind of stops at Stanion, where this picture is taken. But then it gets extended to 7th Avenue in 1892, again, to get you closer to the park and closer to the racetrack and the attractions that we are going to explain in a second. What else we got? Oh, here's another streetcar, actually cable car, that went out and went down Fifth Avenue to dump people off on Fulton to go to the park. This was kind of a funny one because instead of a normal turntable at the end, they actually had a horse that was tethered there all day long, whose only job was to basically turn the car around to go back. They had a little Y there, and the car would be hooked up to the cable car and basically do that little loop to get it going back the right direction. What else? 7th Avenue. This is our steam train going out 7th. And here's pretty much the only picture you see of this train inside that waiting station that you can still see on Fulton today. This starts in 1890. It eventually gets extended to 24th Avenue. Here, let's see if we can make the line go. There you go. Little green line goes out Fulton to 24th Avenue in 1894. And we'll explain why these things are going west a little later. The last steam train that runs on this is in 1902. And then even here on 6th Avenue, we had a streetcar that ran all the way until 1948, the 4 line. So you have multiple ways to get to Golden Gate Park, and the north side of the park, the Richmond district, as well as the east side along Stanion, were basically the primary ways that people went to the park to enjoy it on the weekends. So that explains all these transit lines kind of converging here. But the racetrack is a big draw as well. There's the McAllister line going farther out to 24th Avenue. And again, we'll explain why it goes to 24th Avenue in just a bit. Okay, back to our map. Let's talk a little bit about some competition that Colonel Dickey had. You had the casino in the park, you had Dickey's place on Fifth Avenue, and then you had, that's pretty much it. You could pretty much drink in some small shack here or there or at the racetrack. But we get some competition on 7th Avenue, thanks to that steam line, by the way, in the form of a bar called the Shamrock. And again, it's like a restaurant and bar, and it's run by a couple named Anton and Julia Herzo. This is the northwest corner of 7th and Fulton. And like a lot of early bars in San Francisco, which was famous for this, they would basically put out a free buffet to help draw people, get them thirsty, and keep them in the place to drink rather than go to another place. The Shamrock had this great sort of onion parapet, as you can see here, to kind of advertise on the corner. And here it had 15 rooms. This is something I found interesting that they described it as having 15 rooms, because what happens inside these roadhouses is a little mysterious and not quite explained in a lot of the contemporary accounts. But you might have a private room to do your drinking or have a party with somebody or to eat. But there was a lot of probably subversive prostitution going on in a lot of these places as well, although maybe not at the Shamrock. All right. Told you we only have a couple of bars. It's kind of sleepy. It's sort of the golden age of the proto Beertown, you might say, along Fulton. Pretty tame. And I'm sure there was some great stuff, kind of racy things happening, but you don't have the crowds as much as you do when something big happens in 1894. And this is it was a World's Fair in Chicago in 1893. Michael DeYoung, who is the publisher of the Chronicle, was representing California and kind of in charge of California's displays at this World's Fair in Chicago. He has this bright idea. He's like, why not have a World's Fair in San Francisco to boost the city and its economy? We were kind of in a depression nationally, and it could be done almost on the cheap. We could kind of recycle a lot of these attractions and rides and other things from the Chicago Fair and have it in San Francisco in the winter, which Chicago couldn't do, to just kind of show off the climate and really kind of boost California as a destination and a place for business. So he succeeds in getting this going. The 1894 California Midwinter International Exposition, shorthand the Midwinter Fair, comes and basically gets created in what we call the music concourse today, is the creation of the music concourse. It's it's at one side, the speed with which this was done was amazing. It's in one way very elegant and exotic and just kind of big in scale and ambition. And in other ways, it is done on the cheap and very hokey. So you have these incredible architecture. This building's almost made of paper mache, the Mechanical Arts Building, but beautiful and very grand. And again, kind of Moorish, Middle Eastern, very sort of fanciful architecture was put in with this and a lot of color used. And then you have technology. So electricity is the big high tech at the time. So they build what's called an electric tower, an Eiffel Tower, essentially, about the third the size of the real Eiffel Tower. And they have a giant search beam on the top of it that supposedly could shoot a beam to downtown San Francisco and you could read a newspaper at night. That's how it was advertised. A lot of electricity, a lot of light, and as I said, a lot of hokey rides. So you have belly dancers, you have all sorts of kind of carny things. This was called Dante's Inferno. It's kind of a scare ride or attraction where you go in the mouth of this dragon and guys dressed up in devil suits kind of poke you with pitchforks. Um, but the crowd showed up, as you can see. Also, just want to point out the Firth wheel. Chicago had essentially the first Ferris wheel invented by a man named George Ferris. They couldn't get they couldn't come to an agreement on a licensing agreement with Ferris, so they just basically made a knockoff called the Firth wheel, much smaller than the Ferris wheel. But as I said, all these crowds are coming out to Golden Gate Park. They're all coming on those same transit lines we talked about, and this seems like a great opportunity to make a little money off the fair outside the park. Along Fulton Street, we have Saloonville get started. And this is even before the fair starts. The fair is kind of announced in August of 1893. And by October, they're talking about all these bars that are already there, like Dickey's and the Shamrock and the Little Shamrock, which we'll talk about in a minute, Hardee's, the Universal, they're all joined by very quickly tossed up shacks that are calling themselves saloons, but are not maybe of the highest quality. There's considerable saloon overflow from this point. There being 23 bar rooms along the route of the Gary Street cars between the park and Central Avenue. So that's just getting to Fulton Street. And then you have all these bars going up there in anticipation of the fair. So this is just a little slice around 7th, 8th Avenue and Fulton. This is much later. This is actually years later, but you can kind of see the kind of businesses that are being built there. There is room for further infection among the bewildering array of saloons and restaurants, which are daily springing up for the benefit of fair visitors. From the number of saloons, it is evident that the proprietors expect to struggle against an overpowering demand for steam beer when the exposition opens. Again, exposition has just barely opened. This is, December. It's going to open in January, and the caricatures come out and just show all these shacks going up, the suburb of bar rooms, redolent of fresh paint and plentifully stocked with steam beer. And on the lower right there, it's like, real estate guys are trying to sell real estate. They're in the sand dunes. Anything, it's like a big boom, right? This fair is going to like just turn this neighborhood, which is very open and sandy, into just a boom town is the idea. And of course, you want to sell the beer. So, how does this affect the Shamrock? I told you in that, or you saw in that other article, they mentioned the Little Shamrock. So, Julia Herzo, her husband, Anton, is obviously ill. And in 1893, when the fair is getting planned, and she seems to be kind of like thinking of the future and making a little insurance policy. So she buys a lot on Fifth Avenue, 2 blocks east of their bar, the Shamrock. And her husband dies in July. the next month. And then by the following month, she has already basically constructed the Little Shamrock in the Richmond district at Fifth Avenue as sort of an extension of the Shamrock and in anticipation of the fair. Now, you might know the Little Shamrock that's in the Sunset District. That is a second Little Shamrock. This very enterprising woman opens also for the fair. And that one is still there on Lincoln Way, just off Ninth Avenue, the oldest continually operating bar in the city. So go have a pint there sometime. But built for the 1893 fair, the second Little Shamrock. She basically has an empire of three shamrocks. And then later, she actually has another bar on Ocean Avenue. She's quite the businesswoman. All right. I just want to kind of go back here to give you a view. This is 14, 15 years after the fair, but to give you sort of a view of how this little boom town of bars just exploded on Fulton Street. So you can kind of see the onion, we're seeing the back of the Shamrock here, that little onion parapet there on the left, and the cottage on the right. So some of the architecture is very interesting. It's not all cheap. It's kind of done fanciful to get people in. And that tower on the right, we're going to talk about that. I think that if when you saw like this talk being advertised, those towers on Fulton are really the eye catchers. Um, so all these bars come up. Hopefully they sold lots of steam beer to the thousands of people who showed up from January to June. The fair closes though. Here they are taking down the electric tower, and that is the early D. Young Museum in the background, one of the only things left from the fair when it got closed. And the crowds go. So now you're back to all these people with their big enterprises and, coming to make tons of money off the crowds now are like, whoa, what's the next big thing? Because now we don't have anybody to sell our beer to except for the folks that come to the park. Um, Luckily, there's a little fad going on that gets everybody excited. Let's talk about it by looking at the towers again. So the first tower here was a place called Breckles Hotel, and it was opened in 1894. And you can kind of see that seems like a good idea. There's going to be people going to the fair. You build this hotel. Maybe this whole neighborhood's going to really build up, and people are going to come to the park on the weekends. So here's a place to stay. We'll build a fancy-ish hotel. The other tower actually is after the fair, 1895, and it is trying to capture a fad that was sweeping San Francisco and most of the nation, something called bicycling. Everybody wanted to bicycle in the mid 1890s. So I don't know. I kind of think of it as like Alonzo Trueworthy is sort of like the Mark Benioff of the time, and he wants to build a Salesforce tower of bike rental spaces. So this ridiculous thing to sort of catch the eyes of people coming to rent bikes, bike clubs that are going to start long rides. So that explains this very strange bell tower on the top, as he's just trying to be the best bicycle renter and club in the entire city during the height of this peak, this mania for bicycles. But there's bad news. It turns out cycleries do not pay. Too many of them have been opened. So there's a glut on these all around the park on Stanton and the Richmond. And it doesn't take long before the park cyclery is not really paying the bills. And it later becomes a riding school, horse riding. So it's there until you can see 1919, that tower was still there. Um, but something else is interesting about this picture from 1919, and this might be a more familiar view to you all. You can see St. Ignatius Church in the distance, looking east on Fulton and the park on the right. This feels more like the Richmond today. But look at this building over here. This is actually two buildings kind of mirrored, and it's right on the corner of Fifth Avenue and Fulton. This was the site of the beginning of all this. This was Colonel Dickey's lot where he had his roadhouse and his stable. Around the turn of the century, Dickey fades from the scene. So first thing that happens, Bay District Racetrack closes in 1896. Here's Dickey, Colonel Dickey. And it's the same old story. Rich men, they want to better racetrack. They want a grander racetrack. They want better facilities and a nice club room. They want warmer weather. So new tracks open in Ingleside and then another one in Emeryville and then eventually down at Tanfran. And the crowds just aren't there. The money isn't there for the Bay District racetrack, and it closes in 1896. So now, again, the bars, Beertown, have lost a lot of potential customers. Luckily, something comes to save it. Bicycling didn't work, fair's over, racetrack closes, but the United States goes to war, and a whole bunch of soldiers on their way, volunteer soldiers on their way to the Spanish-American War in the Pacific, come to San Francisco and are temporarily uh, biovaced, I guess you would call it, in San Francisco. Presidio doesn't have room for all these volunteer soldiers, and eventually they create what's called Camp Merritt in the open land of the Richmond district, including the Bay District racetrack. So along Arguello, we have a lot of tents, and then even an annex was created just east of Arguello Boulevard. So just to kind of orient you, the houses going down from left to right in the bottom here, that's along Stanion Street, going down to where Gary is today. So this is over here is where Roosevelt Middle School or junior high school is today. And behind it would be where the Office Depot is. So you have all these soldiers in town waiting to get shipped off to the Philippines. They're here most of the summer. They're pretty unsanitary, these camps, but they're all very thirsty. And so not only do the original saloons and bars along Fulton do pretty darn well, but new groggeries open along Arguello and near Gary. And just like with the saloons during the 1894 fair, the newspapers are like, there's too many saloons. There's too many bars. There are reports of fighting and drunken soldiers in the streets. And who knows what's going on behind the doors of these innocent looking saloons. These are all the articles going on. Here's a view of the old Bay District racetrack land and some soldiers posing on it that are camping there. In the background, we're looking kind of southwest, mostly west. You'll see Fifth Avenue in the background and the towers along Fulton there of the hotel and the cyclery. And then we get a little closer. You can see the Little Shamrock, the second Little Shamrock. Well, the first Little Shamrock, second Shamrock, right here. And she does a great business. Um, the Little Shamrock on Fifth Avenue closes in 1905, but there's a lot of soldiers here posing in this picture, so I brought it back. Once the soldiers leave, we have another attraction a couple years later to help keep people coming, not only to the park, but to the Richmond district and along Fulton. And that was a little amusement zone called the Chutes. Has a water ride, like you probably have ridden in other amusement parks where you get in a little boat and go down a ramp and splash at the bottom. It also had little Ferris wheel type things and spin arounds, a theater. Some of the first movies ever shown in the Richmond district were shown at the Chutes Theater. Here's a nice kind of panorama of it. So it drew people in the early part of the 20th century. Uh, Here's some more shots of the Chutes. This was about 10th Avenue and Fulton Street that we're talking about. All right. Here's the last real big boom to the Beertown. The 1906 earthquake and fire burns most of the core of the city, burns most of the residential sections, the downtown business sections, just total devastation. Doesn't get to the Richmond district. There is some damage earthquake wise, but the fires don't get this far. But you have more than 200,000 people displaced that are looking for places to live, that need to find shelter. This is a disaster. The city leaders are like really worried that San Francisco is going to lose most of its population and especially its blue collar population, which it will need to rebuild the city and keep its preeminence. Here's a view looking to Telegraph Hill just to show you the sort of devastation, the real devastation of the fire after the earthquakes. This is St. Francis of Assisi Church still there on Vallejo, but most everything is gone. And if you actually hear anybody sort of tell you that the saloon in North Beach is the oldest bar in the city, it would be somewhere around here. And I can tell you the Little Shamrock was standing when the saloon was nothing but cinders. So when you talk about continuously operating, we're going to have to go with Little Shamrock. So to house all these folks, they first have refugee camps that have tents in parks, but they also quickly move to the cottage plan where they build these little starter homes, earthquake cottages, for all the refugees ahead of the winter. So these are little starter homes that provide shelter, but could also be moved to empty lots to kind of get people to stay in the city. And one of the camps, the largest, was on what is today Park Presidio Boulevard. So we're looking north to the Presidio and essentially from Cabrillo, there's Clement Street. This building is still there today. You can go over to Funston and Funston? Yeah, Funston's on this side. No, anyway, whatever. 12th Avenue and Clement. I lived in this neighborhood my whole life. I can't remember. Is still there today. And all these refugees are the latest customer base for Beertown. Now, they're supposed to be run kind of like military camps. They don't want people getting drunk. They don't want bars nearby. But it turns out that once restrictions on alcohol service after the earthquake are lifted, Beertown is a wonderful place to get a drink, legally and illegally. So here's a list of, in the center, there's a list of disreputable houses to which the San Francisco Call wanted to call the attention of the police to. And you'll see that three of them there are right on Fulton Street, right in the heart of Beertown. And on the right, you see here that the locality is infested with houses of bad character. In the last 2 weeks, three disreputable places have established themselves around 6th, 7th, and Fulton Street. So let's take a look just at those blocks because we can kind of go back in time pretty close to that era. So this is 1907. This is about a year later, and we'll kind of zoom in a little bit over here. Remember that place the Dickies took over, the two little buildings there on the bottom right? We're going to see those in a sec. Breckles Hotel. People had a lot of problem with Breckles Hotel. A hotel is a great place to have a bar and maybe get some action upstairs. So that was called out. But the little two mirrored buildings, one of them is still there today. This was one of the places called out by the San Francisco Call as a house of ill repute during the riotous Beertown days just after the earthquake. Still there today. It's pretty much the only building that is still on Fulton from that era. So go take a look at it sometime. Also, not too long after the post-earthquake Beertown, you can kind of see the Winona, which was another place that was called out as having some licentious activities going on upstairs. And if we go a little farther down the block, 1907 again, we saw a little bit of this pictures. You can see how some of these buildings are set up with rooms upstairs, but they're mostly serving drinks downstairs. Again, same era, 1908, not too far. Thank goodness they were repairing the streetcar tracks so we can get these pictures. But let's just take a look at one of these buildings. This is one of the better bars, just in kind of attractions, the old Nuremberg. And if you zoom in, the SFMTA archive is great with these glass negatives. You can really zoom in and see a lot of detail and see the ad on the top for the Wunderbier and the sketches of the barmaid, the drawings. And if you look in the alcove, you can actually see Junger's old Nuremberg. You can see postcards and cigar boxes and, liquor for sale. And look at those swinging doors, like straight out of the Old West. Valley Brew Lager. So it kind of puts you almost in Beertown. You almost feel like with Google Maps, you can go through those doors. But I'm sorry, we can't. Looking farther down that same block, you can see in the distance the chutes we mentioned, the little kind of a early proto roller coaster there sticking up at 10th. And the Jockey Club, which was a great place just in looks. It has this open veranda around the top on the corner there. I don't know what this guy on the bottom with the bicycle is doing, but he's looking for action, I think. There he is. Bicycle. There's the Arbor, the former Jockey Club. And again, look, wouldn't that be a great place on a warm day on the corner of 9th and Fulton to like sit up there and have a drink and look at the park? Arbor was demolished in 1914, but another, just a great place. I would totally go there. Okay. Remember I said the Bay District racetrack closed? Well, the neighborhood had started changing after Camp Merritt closed and the land was sold for housing. And that's where we start to get the residential character of the Richmond district. Here are houses going up by the Fernando Nelson Company along Second Avenue. If you go there today, these houses are pretty much there on Second and Balboa. So you start having families moving out there even before the earthquake. After the earthquake, with all those people displaced and looking for new homes, the Richmond really kind of booms as a residential neighborhood. And this is where we get to the end of Beertown because families moving in, churches being built, businessmen coming in. They don't like the idea of a riotous beer saloon strip along Fulton Street. They want this to be a very family-friendly neighborhood. And so the Improvement Club, one of its first sort of achievements it likes to trumpet is lobbying for the closure of the bars. And here's their clubhouse, which you can go walk by today. It's like a Richmond, I mean, a Russian Seventh-day Adventist church today. This is on, let's see, I think it's 8th Avenue between Cabrillo and Balboa, this sort of temple improvement clubhouse. But you can see, like, their campaign against vice is the big thing they're trumpeting by 1910, that they were closing the taverns. They were making sure women couldn't get liquor in the bars, trying to freeze these places out. So what happens? Well, if this is the way vice always works, if everybody's trying to push you out, you just move a little farther to the side. So remember the casino, which was the roadhouse built in 1882 in the park? Later, the park shuts down the liquor sales. Well, a guy says, I like that building. In 1896, he buys it and moves it out of the park all the way out to 24th Avenue in Fulton. So remember I said those lines, those little transit lines kept extending west and they mostly stopped at 24th Avenue? It was really just to get to the casino, which was out there. And then you can also see these cars, these early automobiles. So that changes the character of everything too. Pretty soon you're not dependent on these transit line terminuses to have your bar business. People can drive anywhere they want. And the old sort of driving out Point Lobos Road in your horse to go drinking, now you go driving, you can go all the way to Ocean Beach and drink. And so that starts creating other opportunities. And one out on 36th Avenue. Here, let's kind of zoom in. This is 1909. We're looking east from Golden Gate Park, across the sand dunes here. That's Fulton Street, the streetcar being put in along Fulton Street. And then you see this building out here. Let's take a look at that. So over here on the right distance, that's the casino that got moved out to 24th Avenue. And this is a new hotel slash roadhouse called the Cairns, Hotel Cairns. Opens in 1907 after the earthquake again. People have automobiles. It's still a long way to go. There's no transit there in the early days. But you can stay the night. And so all those sort of, I don't know, under the radar activities that are happening in some of these roadhouses, they're just saying, we're a hotel. What happens upstairs is kind of up to you. And the great thing is this building's still there. It eventually became a sanitarium and now an apartment building. Recently was repainted, but just a great sort of remnant roadhouse in the Richmond district. And then again, with the cars, you can go even farther out. So out at Ocean Beach at Sheehan's, which was at the end of Fulton Street and Great Highway. Whole other story. A whole bunch of roadhouses start opening up, and they have their own problems with the law and vice campaigns. But before we leave Beertown forever, I've got to tell you, you say, what happened? Why aren't these places here? It's mostly that improvement club. They got the zoning changed so that all of that strip was basically made residential. If you go there today, it'd probably be surprising that you're right across from the park and you have like one business, which is you can rent roller skates. But all the other businesses, the zoning just kind of froze out any possibility of having bars and restaurants on that strip. So let's look at it today. Here's the Winona, Fulton, and 6th Avenue in 1908. If we go there today, it looks like this. Apartment buildings. Here's Fulton Street between 7th and 8th. We're looking west to the old Nuremberg there. There's the Universal, which was built in 1893. It's a little white bar on the right there. Today, it's mostly apartment buildings. Here's old Nuremberg. We're looking towards the chutes on 8th Avenue. Looks like that today. So that's the story of Beertown, really. It was like erupted, flowered, blossomed, then like all beer, it eventually fizzled and was shut out. I hope you enjoyed talking about this, and we can have a little Q&A now, which I'll stop the recording so we don't have that for the YouTube channel. But we can talk more about Beertown. I want to thank you all for coming tonight.